Okay, just want to check that my audio is coming through. Okay. Sorry, I think there's a bit of feedback there. So today I'm going to be reading section 2 and 3 of Hume's Enquiry into Human Understanding. Section 2, the origin of ideas, and section 3 of the association of ideas. So we're going to take them pretty slow because they're quite small sections, which is why I've lumped them into one reading. But they are quite important in terms of following Hume's argument throughout the rest of the book and kind of picking up onto the subterranean layer, which is more about the purpose of philosophy and the purpose of thought itself, as opposed to, you know, the sort of materialist stuff, which and the empiricist stuff, which normally is the normal interpretation. So here we go. I just want to check that my audio isn't fuzzy because it seems to be fuzzy on the live stream, but let's double check. Sorry about this, 1 second. This is a learning process. Okay, yeah, it's just fuzzy because of feedback. That's my bad. Sorry for the delay. Section 2, on the origin of ideas. Everyone will readily allow that there is a considerable difference between the perceptions of the mind when a man feels the pain of excessive heat or the pleasure of moderate warmth, and when he afterwards recalls to his memory this sensation or anticipates it by his imagination. These faculties may mimic or copy the perceptions of the senses, but they can never entirely reach the force and vivacity of the original sentiment. The utmost we say of them, even when they operate with the greatest vigour, is that they represent their object in so lively a manner that we could almost say we feel or see it. But, except the mind must be disordered by disease or madness, they can never arrive at such a pitch of vivacity as to render these perceptions altogether indistinguishable. All the colours of poetry, however splendid, can never paint natural objects in such a manner as to make the description be taken for a real landscape. The most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation. We may observe a like-minded distinction to run through all the other perceptions of the mind. A man in a fit of anger is actuated in a very different manner from the one who only thinks of that emotion. If you can tell me that any person is in love, I easily understand your meaning and form a just conception of a situation, but never can mistake that conception for the real disorders and agitations of the passion. When we reflect on our past sentiments and affections, our thought is a faithful mirror and copies its objects truly, but the colours which it employs are faint and dull, in comparison of those which our original perceptions are clothed. It returns no nice discernment or metaphysical headmark to mark the distinction between them. Here, therefore, we may divide all the perceptions of the mind into two classes or species, which are distinguished by their different degrees of force and vivacity. The less forcible and lively are commonly denominated thoughts or ideas. The other species want a name in our language, and in most others, I suppose, because it does not requisite for any but philosophical purposes to rank them under a general term or appellation. Let us therefore use a little freedom and call them impressions, employing that word in a sense somewhat different from the usual. By the term impression, then, I mean all our more lively perceptions that we hear or see or feel or love or hate or desire or will. And impressions are distinguished from ideas, which are the less lively perceptions of which we are conscious. When we reflect on any of those sensations or movements mentioned above. Nothing, at first view, may seem more unbounded than the thought of man, which not only escapes all human power and authority, but is not even restrained within the limits of nature and reality, to form monsters and join incongruous shapes and appearances, costs the imagination no more trouble than to conceive the most natural and familiar objects. And while the body is confined to one planet along which it creeps with pain and difficulty, the thought can in an instant transport us to the most distant regions of the universe, or even beyond the universe, into the unbounded chaos, where nature is supposed to lie in total confusion. What never was seen or heard of may yet be conceived, nor is anything beyond the power of thought except what implies an absolute contradiction. But though our thought seems to possess this unbounded liberty, we shall find upon a nearer examination that it is really confined within very narrow limits, and that all this creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded to us by the senses and experiences. When we think of a golden mountain, we only join two consistent ideas, gold and mountain, with which we are formally acquainted. A virtuous horse we can conceive, because from our own feeling we can conceive virtue, and this we may unite into the figure and shape of a horse, which is an animal familiar to us. In short, all the materials of thinking are derived either from those outward or inward sentiment. The mixture and composition of these beings alone, to the mind and will, or to express myself in philosophical language, all our ideas or more feeble perceptions are copies of our impressions or more lively ones. To prove this, the two following arguments will, I hope, be sufficient. First, when we analyse our thoughts or ideas, however compounded or sublime, we always find that they resolve into such simple ideas as were copied from a present feeling or sentiment. Even those ideas which at first view seem the most wide of this origin are found upon a nearer scrutiny to be derived from it. The idea of God as meaning an infinitely intelligent, wise and good being arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind and augmenting without limit those quantities of goodness and wisdom. We may prosecute this inquiry to what length we please, where we shall always find that every idea which we examine is copied from a similar impression. Those who do not assert that this position is not universally true, nor without exception, have only one, and that an easy method of refuting it by producing that idea, which in their opinion is not derived from this source. It will then be incumbent upon us, if we would maintain this doctrine, to produce the impression or lively perception which corresponds to it. Secondly, if it happens from a defect of the organ that a man is not susceptible to any species of sensation, we always find that he is as little susceptible to the correspondent ideas. Restore either of them sense in which he is deficient by opening this new inlet for his sensations. You can also open an inlet for the ideas which he finds no difficulty in conceiving these sensations. Has never been applied to the organ. A Laplander or Negro has no notion of the relish of wine, and there are few or no instances of a like deficiency in the mind where a person has never felt or is wholly incapable of a sentiment or passion that belongs to his species. Yet we find the same observation to take place in a less degree. A man of mild manners can form no idea of inverterate revenge or cruelty, nor can a selfish heart easily conceive the heights of friendship and generosity, which it is readily allowed, that many other beings may possess many senses of which we can have no conception. Because the ideas of them have never been introduced to us in the only manner by which an idea can have access to the mind, to the wit, by the actual feeling and sensation. There is, however, one contradictory phenomenon, which may prove if there is not absolutely impossible for ideas to arise, independently of their correspondent impressions. I believe it will readily be allowed that there's several distinct ideas of colour which enter by the eye, or those of sound which are conveyed by the ear, are really different from each other, though at the same time resembling. Now, this be true of different colours, it must be no less of the different shades of the same colour, and each shade produces a distinct idea, independent from the rest. For if this should be denied, it is possible, by the continual graduation of shades, to run a colour insensibly into what is most remote from it. And if you will not allow any of the means to be different, you cannot, without absurdity, deny the extremes to the same. Suppose, therefore, a person to have enjoyed his sight for 30 years, and to have become perfectly acquainted with colours of all kinds, except one particular shade of blue, for instance, which it has never been in his fortune to meet with. Let all the different shades of that colour, except that single one, be placed before him, descending gradually from the deepest to the lightest. It is plain that he will perceive a blank where that shade is wanting, and will be sensible that there is a greater distance in that place between the contiguous colours than in any other. Now, I ask whether it may be possible for him, from his own imagination, to supply this deficiency, and raise up to himself the idea of that particular shade, though it has never been conveyed to him by his senses. I believe there are a few, but will be of the opinion that he can, and this may serve as proof that the simple ideas are not always, in every instance, derived from the correspondent impressions, though this instance is so singular that it is scarcely worth our observing, and does not merit for that alone we should alter our general maxim. Here, therefore, is a proposition, which not only seems in itself simple and intelligible, but, if a proper use were made of it, might render every equally intelligible, and banish all that jargon which has so long taken possession of metaphysical reasonings, and draw disgrace upon them. All ideas, especially abstract ones, are naturally faint and obscure. The mind has but a slender hold on them. They are apt to be confounded with every other resembling ideas, and when we have often employed any term without a thought to a distinct meaning, we are apt to imagine that it has a determinate idea annexed to it. On the contrary, all impressions, that is, all sensations, either outward or inward, are strong and vivid. The limits between them are more exactly determined, nor is it easy to fall into any error or mistake with regard to them. When we entertain, therefore, any suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning or idea, as is but too frequent, we need to inquire from what impression is that supposed idea derived. And if it be impossible to assign any, then this will serve to confirm our suspicion. By bringing ideas into so clear a light, we may reasonably hope to remove all dispute which may arise concerning their nature and reality. Now section 3. Section 3 of the association of ideas. It is evident that there is a principle of connection between the different thoughts or ideas of the mind, and that in their appearance to the memory or imagination, they introduce each other with a certain degree of method and regularity. In our more serious thinking or discourse, this is so observable that any particular thought which breaks upon the regular tract or chain of ideas is immediately remarked and rejected, and even in our wildest and most wandering reveries, nay, in our very dreams, we shall find, if we reflect, that the imagination ran not altogether at adventures, but that there was still a connection upheld among the different ideas which succeeded each other. Were the loosest and freest conversation to be transcribed, there would immediately be observed something which connected it in all other translations. In all its translations, might still inform you that there had secretly resolved in his mind a succession of thought which had gradually led him from the subject of conversation among different languages, even though we cannot suspect the least connection or communication. It is found that the words expressive of ideas, the most compounded, do not yet nearly correspond to each other, a certain proof that the simple ideas comprehended in the compound ones were bound together by some universal principle which had an equal influence on mankind. Though it be too obvious to escape observation that different ideas are connected together, I do not find that any philosopher has attempted to enumerate or class all the principles of association, a subject, however, that seems worthy of curiosity. To me, there appear to be only three principles of connection among ideas, namely resemblance, contiguity in time or place, and cause or effect. That these principles serve to connect ideas will not, I believe, be much doubted. A picture naturally leads our thoughts to the original. The mention of one apartment in a building naturally introduces an inquiry or discourse concerning the others. And if we think of a wound, we can scarcely forbear reflecting on the pain which follows it. But that this enumeration is complete, and that there are no other principles of association except these may be difficult to prove this to the satisfaction of the reader, or even to a man's own satisfaction. All we can do in such cases is to run over several instances and examine carefully the principle which binds the different thoughts to each other, never stopping till we render the principle as general as possible. The more instances we examine and the more care we employ, the more assurance shall we acquire that the enumeration which we form from the whole is complete and entire. Wonderful. So that was section 2 and 3. 2 was the origin of ideas, and 3 is of the association of ideas. So you can see these are quite important, although they're short, in terms of introducing the idea of Hume's impressions. So although it's not, in my opinion, a complete interpretation of what's going on here, philosophically speaking, that's definitely, deriving thoughts from the impressions, which are empirical sense information. And Hume is basically saying that, there's connections between these things, yes, that go on in our mind, but all those connections are only ever sparked by the original sense impressions, the external empirical information that's coming in. And naturally that so you can read that as it being a purely empirical doctrine of, everything's about impressions and that's kind of all there is. But Hume admits here in part 3 the resemblance, contiguity and cause and effect as well, which we'll get onto. But resemblance and contiguity are really important here because he talks about the apartment, which implies the building and the location, and a picture of something which sparks the association with the original subjects. And that kind of proves that although Hume's definitely saying that the sense impressions are somehow, they take precedent in terms of their vivacity, their strength, and also the fact that they're the first thing to happen in the cognitive process. There is a cognitive process going on, and Hume is not just, I don't know if he is entirely in the he's not just kind of a precursor to materialist empiricism, in my opinion, philosophically speaking. Right, so basically, although there can be a very analytical, empirical reading of Hume, he's kind of saying that the analytics of abstract thought fail the truth of the original sense impression. So I wouldn't say he's as analytical as you might assume. And essentially, he's playing off the colour in human thought, the abstractness of human thought, which isn't, although it's secondary to the primary impressions, it's not lacking in colour, it's not lacking in importance to the human animal, the human thinker, the cognitive subject and cognitive industries that, produce intellectual inquiry. But he's playing that off against, natural objects which provide the precursor to all impressions and are sort of remixed together in the colours of the poetry of our thoughts. Um, right, and I guess he's at one point he calls thought appears to have this unbounded liberty because of the power of our imagination, frankly. But his assertion is that because it is buttressed and is subservient in some way to the sense impressions which are derived from the real, perceptually real impressions, that they are not so free as we think, and often our imagination is actually prompted by the kind of the fantasies of our imagination, the elaborations of our abstract ideas are actually prompted by the very realness of the world around us, often in ways we don't understand as well, which is something to bring up, but I don't think he specifically mentions that here. Right, yeah. And yeah, I think that's the main takeaway here, is that he's not discounting abstract thought completely, but he's definitely asserting that it's subservient in some way, although doesn't lose its color and utility in cognitive industry and intellectual inquiry, but it is secondary and prompted, and is essentially reimaginings of empirical sense impression, sense data, reality, essentially. So thanks for watching, and we'll be back with section 4.